Ja, herzlich willkommen zurück, meine Damen und Herren. Vor der Pause haben wir konkrete Beispiele der Anwendung intelligenter Systeme in der Schule kennengelernt. Jetzt wollen wir nochmal grundsätzlicher fragen, wie könnte der verantwortungsvolle Einsatz von KI in der Schule im Unterricht aussehen und noch dazu in der Breite. Wir haben ja mit der Diskussion schon angefangen, aber wir wollen sie jetzt noch weiterführen. Es geht also jetzt weniger um die technischen Möglichkeiten und mehr um die Rezeption in Praxis und Politik. Auf welche kulturellen, politischen, sozialen, rechtlichen Herausforderungen stößt der Einsatz von KI-Anwendungen im Schulalltag? Bevor ich Ihnen aber das zweite Panel vorstelle und wir mit der Diskussion loslegen, freue ich mich auf einen Impuls von Stéphane Vincent-Lacrin, dem stellvertretenden Leiter der OECD-Abteilung für Innovation in der Bildung. Herr Vincent-Lacrin wird uns unter anderem einen Überblick über den Stand des KI-Einsatzes in unterschiedlichen OECD-Staaten geben und über die Rahmenbedingungen, die dort herrschen, und auch ein paar konkrete Anstöße für einen verantwortungsvollen Umgang mit KI in der Bildung. And we're going to listen to his presentation in English. So we're looking forward to your presentation, Stéphane Vincent-Lacrin. The floor is yours.
Danke sehr, Jan-Martin. Nächstes Mal werde ich auf Deutsch präsentieren, aber heute nicht. So I'm going to share my screen and actually make two big points. I'm trying not to speak for too long. That was my brief. But I guess just start because we are the OECD with a few data. So, you know, AI is on the rise. But one thing is that it's just one of the different types of technologies that are coming in education, where the investment is, and actually, interestingly, not perhaps where you know, the market sees the most developments, and you can see that augmented reality, virtual reality is one of the fields where a lot is happening. It's interesting that during the COVID, perhaps a lot of the solutions that were taken up within countries do not involve as much AI as what we had actually anticipated. Even so, we have a few interesting examples. But the main thing I wanted to show you is where the investment in all these new technologies comes from in the world, and actually, you know, point to the fact that China has become one of the greatest investors. The US is the second one, and India comes next, and actually the European Union is kind of lagging behind in terms of investment, and that's something that I believe, you know, we should really keep in mind, also relating to the discussion we're going to have on what kind of framework for the further development of AI we should have in Europe. So a few points, in fact, there are already a few principles. So the OECD and the G20 have issued principles on artificial intelligence, which is about basically, you know, how to have a responsible use, you know, so in terms of objective, you know, putting human beings at the center of all the AI developments, etc. So we're already starting, the discussion has started, more generally speaking, and one of the things that we have to do is really to see how this applies in the case of education. So the first thing, a lot of technology, as we've learned in the past, they tend not to be used as much as we want, or, you know, there is always this surprise that a lot of technology does not necessarily translate into technology use. Even so, in the past few decades, this has been the case. And partly because the solutions are not always the one that teachers, schools actually need. And so one way to move forward for that is really to work a bit more with the stakeholders to develop these solutions and make sure that you know, they are really useful for what the teachers, they don't replicate what the teachers already know, can see, but actually provide them with a lot of new information. Some of these solutions are not always effective, and I think that's a very important point, you know, that, and we have to verify the effectiveness of those, you know, are the data produced accurate, you know, so for example, in the case of early warning systems, a lot of systems do not necessarily have much more effectiveness than what we human beings would actually see and do. And so it's very important also to verify all these different things and to have solutions which are actually accurate and that then can lead to important interventions. An interesting way of thinking about it is that many of those solutions actually are not necessarily made to support the decisions that people have to make, but also to make them think a bit differently about what they could do. And so, for example, identifying different types of profiles of students or different reasons why some of the things that they work on are happening. What we've seen during the COVID as well is that, the digital divide, we saw that was a problem of the past, well, it's a problem of a very contemporary one. And it's quite important to have a solution that actually can be equitably spread. And for that, usually going for solutions that can run on existing platforms and really work in terms of policy making on standards, interoperability, etc. So for example, one of the things that happened during the crisis is a lot of platforms provided education resources, but there was in fact, not enough standards for people to find them easily across countries, for example, or sometimes even within the same country. And we have the same kind of problems in terms of technical solutions, and so the interoperability is one of the very important aspects of it. We have a few more issues. Fairness is another one, and so we've already actually spoken about it in the previous panel, how to make sure that you're not replicating the biases due to your historical data. And that's something that we've seen in the English case that was already referred to in the previous session. Sometimes it also has to do with some of the choices that you make when you design your algorithm. So it's not all based on that. And of course, you have to check those results and make sure that you're not creating some new biases as well. So that's a question of where we're going. Transparency is very important for that. We have, in fact, in many countries, this open data movement, which now is spreading and becoming also the open algorithm one, where the idea is basically to allow anyone to see, verify, challenge the algorithm that are being used. In practice, we're talking about other experts, so we have to make sure that there are people who are going to do that. But we also have to see that sometimes there are some limitations because some of the techniques of AI mean that they're difficult to explain to lay people. Sometimes we don't even know exactly what's going to happen in the machine. And so, we also have to be careful not to be too restrictive, but make sure that actually some people understand and verify what's coming out of those algorithms. So one way, and actually that perhaps one of the things that was a bit missing in the English case, is how you involve these stakeholders in the discussion, and that you make the choices that you make more acceptable and more, and you can discuss the fairness of it. One of the things that often comes into discussion is data protection, and of course that's a really huge problem, but in fact one that is usually well regulated. So especially in Europe, Europe has a very strong data protection regulation already. So in fact, it's not so much left to ethics anymore. In the United States, they have FAIRPath, which is one data protection act, especially for education data. It's not as restrictive as GDPR, but it actually also provides a strong framework for data protection. What's important to keep in mind for that one is that if you want to have too much data protection, then you can do nothing, and so it's really a risk management policy that you need to have and have a graded policy which actually, depending on the sensitivity of your data, what you're doing will actually adapt and have the right level, if you want, of it. But one of the big questions, and that will be my last slide, is around, what do we need? Ethics or regulation? Probably both, actually. And some of the important questions for the take-up is, to what extent we are actually willing, so that's a question of values, so are there some benefits that we don't want to have because either the solution is too intrusive or we don't feel comfortable with it, with the values of it, or because there is a risk of misuse of those data. What is the goal, of the AI? Is it to give feedback, support, diagnose? Is it to make decisions? Should we use it, for example, when we have high-stake decisions? Or is it something which should rather be used to give feedback, to support and to diagnose before an intervention rather than to, for example, allow admissions, etc. And of course, there is a question of, all the surveillance possibilities, the big brother that has always been a big problem, even before AI, with the use of data, and as we were able to collect much more. Now things are getting broader, and there are ways to track temperature, for example, when you have the COVID, but we can check, you can see on the two pictures I've put, there are a lot of ways now to monitor and to interpret people's behavior based on biological markers, sometimes face markers, etc. In many cases, we don't have good theories about that. So, it's something that we can do. Sometimes, which can work, which can be extremely useful, but also things which may actually be ahead of what we know in these different areas. And I guess that's really one of the areas where there is some possible risk. But we need to find creative solutions. So for example, when you have these cameras monitoring the full class, one way of doing it, for example, is to delete the data as they are collected, so that in fact we will give a kind of feedback to the teacher on, where your students engage, not engage, etc. Without keeping the information on the individual people in the class. We have to actually become better in the way that we theorize all these different things, to what extent. So for example, what does engagement mean? So if I'm dreaming, does it mean, is it always bad? Perhaps not, actually. And so we have really to rethink a lot of these different things, and that requires a lot of trust. And it's really by working together with different stakeholders, with the schools, etc., that this trust can actually be built. But my last point, and that will be the final one, is really that we need to work with the companies and with people to make things happen. Perhaps in too many conferences I'm going to, especially in Europe, the ethical and regulatory questions are more weight to not to do things, and actually we have to rather think of what we want to do, because this is there, and most likely something is going to happen, including in the education sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. So the last point is very interesting. You started your presentation with data that the European Union is lagging behind in regard to artificial intelligence, and you made this final remark that ethics and regulation should allow something. So you're afraid that actually this lagging behind of the European Union has something to do with our ethics and our regulations?
Oh, I wouldn't make such a causal aspect. No, I think that you have to do it with ethics, and you need to have regulations. But it should be regulation that enable, to develop and to try things, and not that actually blocks. And so my final remark was more that there are many fora where people don't want to do anything because there are risks, and it's true that there are risks which are associated with it. But nonetheless, we need to experiment. We need to try to innovate. And if Europe doesn't, actually, it's going to happen, but elsewhere. That's. And so there is probably a model which is based on the European value that can be developed. but I believe that, you know, there are some, yeah, it should be embraced, so that would be fine.
There was one question in the chat about the situation in Scandinavia, which I found interesting. We know that Scandinavian countries are technologically pretty advanced. At the same time, they have a certain societal standard, or how could I put that, ideal. And maybe we can look at Scandinavia to learn about how to combine both sound ethics and technological advances in artificial intelligence.
I think that what is I find remarkable in Scandinavia is the way that they consult and involve everyone in making some of the decisions, and at the same time that they actually try to develop things so that I would say, you know, those are, it's, you know, in Europe, I would say that Scandinavian countries are one of the places where there are developments in technology and in AI. It's not the only one. UK, Germany, France, you know, there are a few other places as well where there is a strong investment in that. I would say in Scandinavia, the strength is really this broad consultation process to make some of these things acceptable. So sometimes it slows down a little bit, you know, the progress, but then actually it makes it much more, you know, respectful and trustworthy, which is what we want at the end.
We have time for one more question, and that is a question that has popped up twice already, and that was also in my mind. Do we first have to ensure that everybody has the necessary education to understand what artificial intelligence actually is and does, and how can you trust in artificial intelligence systems that they are secure, or that how can you trust in them if you don't have a basic understanding, or many people don't have that basic understanding? And when it comes to students in schools, do they first need to be taught a basic understanding of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think that, of course, that's, you know, if it's becoming one of the big technologies of our times, people should learn about it. Now, should we wait until everyone has learned to try to adopt? I don't think so. In fact, we have already adopted, you know, so people have an Alexa and Google Home and all this stuff at home. It's not in school, you know, and on their phone, everywhere, it's already starting. So, you know, we just have to live with it and see how actually we can use it in such a way that it's going to improve, you know, learning outcomes, people's well-being, and how it's going to become something helpful rather than something that we fear. Mm-hmm. Perhaps keep human beings in control, you know, and so decide on what we want to do with it and what we don't want to do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Stefan. It was a pleasure, and you will stick around and maybe also answer some questions that have come up in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.